Ladies and gentlemen, the commodity crunch session, I guess, is a very important session of this conference over here. We have all witnessed it, the oil prices going up to $150, then going down to $30. We have food price inflation. We also have considerable price movements in the field of metals like copper and so on. We will try to touch upon some of these issues today. We have a very distinguished panel. And before we start with the panel discussion, I'm very pleased to welcome His Excellency, Mr. Sukhbaataryn Batbold of the Mongolian Republic. Mr. Batbold has extensive experience in business as well, for example, in the hospitality industry, in the telecom industry, but also has been a foreign minister of his country and has been elected to the parliament twice before becoming prime minister. Please join me in welcoming His Excellency, Mr. Batbold.
So, Mr. Chairman, and ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to be invited and to speak at this gathering, particularly because the summit organizers invited me here today to speak about my country, about Mongolia. So let me start then by providing some brief overview. Mongolia underwent simultaneous transition towards democracy and free market economy and achieved quite significant results in ensuring fundamental freedoms and human rights. Today, Mongolia, according to international financial institutions, is to become one of the most attractive and possibly the fastest growing economy for the next 5 years. So we have the world-class mineral deposits, particularly those of the copper, just mentioned, gold and coal, among others, are the fast becoming and driving engine for this economic growth. So mining industry produced already almost 85% of our total export. As Mongolia is starting to develop large mining projects, first, the equitable and competitive business environment. Secondly, enhanced transportation and infrastructure services are becoming currently the most important issues for the country's further development. As we improved through broad debate involving all stakeholders and made mutually beneficial our fiscal and regulatory regime related to mining, our next focus is to provide competitive business and investment environment for the business entities both in mining industry and economy in general. In conjunction with this policy this year is announced by our government as a business enabling environment reform year. So its purpose is to improve business environment based on the World Bank indicators of doing business report, as well as other indicators such as global competitiveness ranking by World Economic Forum. Package measures have been approved to reform business legislation and standardization and improving public services. An action plan was developed and Mongolia is already improving its ranking indicators this year in certain respects, particularly on global competitiveness ranking. Our focus currently is also on improving transportation links and transit routes in order to make Mongolia's export more competitive. The Parliament has made a decision in July to approve railway concept that would connect major mining projects and areas with existing railway links initially and other destinations at the second phase. On this issue, we would like to stress once more the necessity and urgency of global and regional cooperation that would ensure competitive transit routes and market access for all landlocked developing countries. To put it simply, realization of the potential for economic growth will be dependent to a large extent on a goodwill and cooperation on the transit traffic. In case of Mongolia, cooperation with Russia and China on improving transit traffic is expanding, and we hope to see further progress on this issue in the near future. I think these are the issue of critical importance currently as we seek to develop our mining industry and ensure it benefits for economic growth of Mongolia. As we are looking into the future, first, ensuring that we are protected from the global fluctuations to the extent it is possible is our top priority. Our main export commodity, copper, devaluated 3 times in 2008, which caused enormous damage to the national economy. And this year we have submitted to the Parliament budget stability law that adopts Chilean model of fiscal stabilization. The law provides for excess revenues to be collected at the stabilization fund and to be utilized under certain conditions. We also have adopted early this year law on Human Development Fund, which would focus on health, education, and housing and social welfare. Development Bank, which is in the process of establishment, will be primary mechanism of financing large-scale infrastructure projects, will be the critical importance in enabling fiscal responsibility, enabling greater benefits for people from the mining revenues and supporting infrastructure development based on a public and private partnership. These 3 objectives are not easy to achieve, all at the same time, and at the times are contradictory, but priority objective of my coalition government is to ensure their synergy. Looking into the future, our second priority is the need of the further industrialization on environmentally sustainable basis. We realize that mining resources are exhaustible. So therefore, we seek to diversify the entire economy structure and improve its self-sustainable capability. Processing coal, chemical industry based on a coal, processing of copper, iron ore, uranium, energy sector, particularly the wind energy, among others, is where the competitive advantages are for Mongolia. We seek to provide supportive taxation and regulatory environment for those industries. There are other areas where Mongolia is traditionally strong. In early 2009, we had almost 44 million heads of animal stock population. Although nearly 8 million were lost during last winter, we anticipate a speedy recovery and further growth in the years to come. We are undertaking a program to improve its breed, productivity, and health protection. Mongolia's target is to process animal hides and skins, wool, cashmere, meat, milk, and many kinds of raw materials to supply them on a domestic market and increase export abroad and overseas. To expand the export market opportunities for Mongolian products abroad, we are actively engaging in trade liberalization efforts. we obtained the right to export designated goods on preferential conditions to European Union member countries under GSP Plus preference system. Mongolia is now negotiating a partnership and cooperation agreement with the European Union and seeking closer relationship with the European Union. We are in the process of concluding joint study economic partnership agreement with Japan, and hopeful that negotiations will start next year. Trade and investment framework agreement with the United States resulted in a regular consultation on further trade liberalization. We are also studying further the opportunity of trade liberalization with our major trade partners, particularly with the two immediate neighbors. Our third priority, which probably is of critical importance looking into the future, is human resource development. It is our conviction that more sustainable growth and more equitable growth will be only reached if Mongolians enhance their skills and learn to produce more efficiently, more technology-intensive goods of higher values. So here our focus is on improving quality of our higher education, focusing more intensively on vocational training, and bringing our secondary education up to the international standards. So Mongolia is putting high priority also on sustainable development, environment protection, and green economy. We emphasize responsible mining, transparency of extractive industries, and development of green energy. Just recently, for the first time, our government had a special meeting in Gobi Desert, an area which is subject to extreme desertification due to the global warming, and the government meeting away from the capital has been decided upon to draw global attention to climate change and environmental damage. We have adopted a special government program to combat desertification, and Gobi message to appeal to more international cooperation in environment protection and adoption of green technology. Mongolia is to become, in the near future, one of the first countries to be verified as fully transparent under Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. So let me conclude by citing a quote of one of the wise Oriental master named Morihei Ueshiba. The ideal economy combines the spiritual and material, and the best commodities to trade in are sincerity and love. So with this, I would like to conclude my remarks and wish successes to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this stimulating keynote address. It also touched upon two important issues, economic diversification and sustainability. Topics that play a large role, for example, in developing countries, not only in Mongolia in the case of finite mining supplies, but also in the Middle East, where there are strong efforts undertaken to diversify the economy away from oil and gas, at least a bit. Or to enhance the value chain of oil and gas production, one might say. At the beginning of the 1970s, there was the Club of Rome report, the limits to growth, and basically the experts at that time said we are running out, supplies will not keep pace with demand. Now, 40 years later, we are still here. Demand has grown tremendously, but so has supply. Some people now say, okay, maybe it's not a commodity crunch at all, but just a usual market reaction. Prices went up. We will see a supply-side reaction. We will see more efficient demand management, and prices will come back to normal like in the 1980s and 1990s in the case of oil and other commodities, which of course also meant a tremendous burden for the commodity producers. Yeah. And I'm very pleased that we have a very interesting panel today that can discuss the various ramifications of these issues.
We have John Felmy. He's chief economist of the American Petroleum Institute, so he can enlighten us a bit what's going on in the oil industry. Is there peak oil or not? Or maybe is it not the maybe it's not the upstream sector at all, but rather other factors like a lack of refining capacity or increased role of speculation. Then we have Mr. Paul Sullivan. Paul is a professor of economics at the National Defense University and at Georgetown University, and he's also our Mr. Middle East here on the panel. He has extensive experience and has taught, for example, at the American University in Cairo. And Paul has also a lot of know-how, a lot of experience in the field of renewable energies, nuclear energy. It's a big question in the Gulf region where I work, basically that oil producers also start to think about other sources of energy because they might make more sense in the energy mix, also because certain sources of energy like gas are not as available as in the past. And it's kind of surprising to many people in the north that, for example, the UAE now has embarked on a large program for nuclear energy and for renewable energies. And other countries are interested in that as well. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iran, Egypt, and so on. And then we have Mr. Joseph Wambia. He is our expertise over here with everything that relates to Africa, with everything that relates also to primary commodities like agriculture, like mining, and so on. And as you are probably aware, Africa is increasingly playing a kind of white knight role in the commodity debate, and there has been a scramble for Africa on part of investors from the Gulf, from China, and also from Western countries. Maybe I'll ask the panelists to start with short 4-minute statements and give us their view about their respective field of interest and where they see commodity markets heading and in which commodities they expect the greatest challenges but also the greatest opportunities. John.
All right, well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the Blouin Foundation for inviting us. This is a very important topic, and I think it's important that we discuss all the ramifications, so thank you very much for the opportunity. I was mentioned Club of Rome talking about running out, and I've been working in energy policy long enough to remember that. I still have the book on my bookshelf that I look at every day to remind myself of what has happened over that period, but they weren't the only ones. You go back to England when a fairly famous economist, William Stanley Jevons, said we were running out of coal. And as Dan Yergin puts it, we've run out of oil 5 times. So it's key that you must understand that we never run out of anything from an economist's perspective. It's merely a question of, and an important question of how expensive it gets. Why haven't we? Well, first of all, we've been able to develop technology that finds more and more oil and natural gas in ways we never dreamed of. We have markets that very carefully allocate resources over the most appropriate places. You know, as an oil industry, we've been around for 150 years, and we hope to be around for a considerable time beyond that, the period right now. But looking forward, what do we face? Well, first of all, there's enough oil and gas in the ground. The question is, will we be able to produce it, and how much will demand be? Everyone knows the forecast in terms of demand for the developing countries. Everybody knows the forecast for the demand for transportation that seems to be continuing to grow, and most of the forecasts show growing from 86 million barrels a day of oil use right now to 106, 110 million barrels. And so that's going to require a significant amount of investment, a significant amount of activity to be able to recover that oil. Will we be able to do it? Will we be able to do it in a sense of making investments in parts of the world that are now controlled by national oil companies, whereas in the past it was international oil companies that had more flexibility in those areas? Will we be able to produce it given potential regulations that could be imposed on the industry? And that's a host of regulations which could influence our activities and everything involved. Will we be able to produce it in terms of the investments that investors are willing to put into this area? And finally, will we be hindered by what we consider is a repeat of foolish energy policy of the past, and that's taxing the oil and gas industry with this notion that we're going to spend it on new energy, and that's going to solve all our problems. That was tried back in the 70s, early 80s. It failed. The proposals are still there. They're being talked about right now, where they're talking about basically taxing an industry that has a lot of energy that's produced, good quality, high-paying jobs that don't require subsidies, and spending the money on industries that clearly will play a role in the future, but don't produce a lot of energy, don't have particularly good paying jobs, and only survive because of subsidies. And so the question we have going forward, will the governments involved allow the development of resources that we know are there? And that's an open question. As the industry likes to say, our problem is not below the ground, it's above the ground. And I can't give you an answer in terms of what that outlook will be, but I hope that every government looks forward carefully and says, this is the energy that our citizens are going to need, and we need to get it to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, good morning. I was asked to take a look at potential renewable energy transitions, and certainly the commodities to focus on with regard to renewable energy transitions will be silicon, copper, important to Mongolia, iron, and rare earths, most of which can be found in China. And those of you who are reading the newspapers this morning realizes that China is no longer exporting the rare earths to Japan because of a fisheries issues between the two countries. And lithium, which oddly enough can be found in vast reserves in Afghanistan. The transition is already upon us in many ways. It's kind of creeping up upon us statistically. About 50% of the new electricity capacity in the United States last year was renewable energy. 60% of the new electricity capacity in Europe was renewable energy. China has massive renewable energy investments. It's also going to be building 24 new nuclear power plants. And why would I mix in nuclear power with renewable? Because with reprocessing and reusing of the waste, you can turn nuclear power into, let's say, 25 to 35% renewable. Uranium is reusable if it's treated properly. In the United States, nuclear energy is going to be a bit slower, but all renewable energy issues to be developed in this country will be through the states and locales. Again, a caveat, I work for the National Defense University. Anything I say has absolutely nothing to do with their opinion. Therefore, I can now state that I consider the political discussions about renewable energy and energy transition in Washington to be dysfunctional. No decisions have been made on environmental policy or energy policy, whereas we got very close to that. The changes that may occur in these policies will happen in the states and the localities and the cities. And also within the federal government, within departments and agencies, and that's already happening in the Department of Defense, which is a vanguard for energy change, believe it or not. The Department of Energy and its laboratories, the EPA, the Department of Transportation with Fast Rail. US and world energy systems are still mostly fossil fuels, about 85% in the OECD, and it's going to take a long time to transition from fossil fuels without causing huge dislocations socially, economically, and energetically. But the changes are coming around the bend a lot faster than most people realize, particularly in the massive wind investments and solar investments. Germany, not a sun capital of the world, has the #1 area or space of solar panels. China, in its clean energy investment, increased 53% just last year. China is the largest renewable energy investor in the world overall in 2009. 37 of the 80 gigawatts of renewable energy installed in 2009 was in China. Worldwide, and this may be a shocker to some of you, even to some energy experts, renewable energy investments were greater than fossil fuels investments in 2008 and 2009 with regard to electricity generation, not in your business of oil and gas, because your business is a very expensive one. China is the biggest investor in wind, much bigger overall renewable energy than the US. Globally, 18% of all Generating electricity power is from renewable. And I told you about what the new renewable stuff is coming around the bend. One of the big blocking points in all this is going to be rare earths. The United States, a few years ago, in all the wisdom of certain strategic leaders, decided to shut down all of our rare earths mines. It will take a long time to reestablish those. Right now, the world is dependent on China and a few other countries for those rare earths. And if you can find some of those in your country, it would be most welcome.
We do have.
Yes.
We do have.
Very good. It's good to hear. We can talk about that.
Yes, we'll talk.
With regard to the nuclear revival, a carbon tax would help, but I'm sure Mr. Felmy kind of flinches at the carbon tax in many ways, and I read some of your readings, and I can understand why. The cost to build a nuclear power plant are quite expensive. The time to build them, it takes a long time. There's an insurance premium and investment premiums that are added in, which make these costly. For the nuclear industry in this country, the biggest issue is policy uncertainty. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time to build one of these, and you have to convince your board members and your investors that you're going to get something back from it. Another problem is the waste stream for nuclear power. Reprocessing can take care of this issue to some extent, but during the time of President Carter, we shut down our reprocessing activities in a unilateral measure to try to reduce proliferation, and the end result was proliferation increased. There is a small country in the Middle East which has the entire nuclear fuel cycle, including reprocessing, and that's Iran. And one thing that throws up flags for me is the reprocessing technology that Iran uses is called Purex, which is a way to separate out pure plutonium and pure highly enriched uranium at the same time. There's another way of reprocessing called Eurex, which does not bring out the pure plutonium that could be bomb grade. Again, that should send up some flags, and we have a visitor in town. I'd like to ask him about that one, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do that. Uranium, we have considerable reserves, about 5.4 million metric tons. According to recent uses, that's about 80 years left, but when it comes to predicting in energy and commodity markets, next week things could change. If you take a look at the predictions for oil over the last 50 years, almost none of them were right. But getting back to the economics, if the price of uranium goes up considerably, one of the driving forces will be the increase in nuclear power plants in China, Russia, and India, then there will be more exploration and more production for uranium. The issue is the timing of the investment toward exploration and production and the timing of the increase in the demand for uranium because of the building of the nuclear power plants. We should look for countries that have lots of phosphates. You find uranium in phosphates. Jordan has 2% of all uranium in the world, and it's found in its phosphates. Coal has uranium in it, and the ocean has uranium in it. Uranium is as findable as zinc and tin, depending on the price of the uranium. There's also the potential of using thorium for nuclear reactors, and thorium is actually more prevalent than uranium. So if the price gets too much, the technology can switch more toward the Canadian-style nuclear plants, the CANDU nuclear plants, and use thorium. There's a political side to this. We are negotiating, meaning the United States within our Congress, a new START treaty, which was signed by the President and President Medvedev to reduce nuclear weapons in both of our countries. There's a project called megatons to megawatts, which is, well, if we look at the lights in this room, about 10% of that light is coming from former nuclear bombs, which is a good thing. Less bombs, more light. If this goes through the Senate, and that's up to question right now, there could be a lot more uranium to be used to produce electricity and hence make the market more flexible. China proposes 130 new nuclear plants. Russia proposes 30, India 40, South Africa 24. The US is talking 22, and they can't even get their act together for one of them. Vietnam is thinking of 10. The Ukraine, 10. Turkey, getting to the Middle East, 1. Jordan, 1. Egypt, 1. The UAE, 10 are proposed. And Israel is thinking about building 1 nuclear electric plant. It's the only country on earth that has a nuclear program and doesn't produce a single kilowatt hour, which is kind of curious. Another thing that will determine the nuclear revival is the cost of the alternative sources of producing electricity, whether there's another accident that will happen, and whether transport vehicles are shifted to electric rather than liquid fuels, amongst about 1,000 other factors, but I think I've even gone over my time. This is the sort of issue I could talk about for the next 3 days, as you can imagine. It's fascinating. It's going to be world-changing, and you're probably all going to see some of these things happening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, and also for the to the Lewis Foundation for inviting me to this conference. It's a real privilege to be sitting here with this distinguished gentleman on this panel. I was asked to talk about the commodity crunch and its potential impact on Africa. And I was asked to comment on the commodity crunch and its potential impact on Africa. One of the things that you look back at the history in the last few decades is that commodity price bubbles come and go, and for a commodity producing continent like Africa, which is the richest continent on earth in terms of natural resources, and it's an agricultural-based economy, the overall impact is highly positive. It used to be in the 70s and the early 80s that high oil prices negatively impacted African economies. That is no longer the case. It's the exact opposite. High oil prices, by and large, benefit African economies because many African countries are now major oil producers, Angola, Nigeria, a whole slew of them. One other advantage that we're seeing with high oil prices in Africa is giving economic viability to alternative energy investments. The higher the oil price, the more viable it is for Africa to invest, African countries find to invest in alternative energy. And while Africa is the least intensive user of energy in the world, and in fact the energy intensity is directly proportional to the level of development, it also has, with that disadvantage, a very unique advantage. That is, it doesn't have an industry that is based on fossil fuel, a large enough industry that is based on fossil fuel and investment, and without the political vested interest that resists change. Oil companies, as you know, are very powerful, and in weak countries, they topple governments, and it's very hard to bring about change when you have a major oil industry that has a lot of investment and vested interest. One of the advantages for Africa is that's not, by and large, it's not on the ground. And so you have economies benefiting from technology developed in the United States and in other advanced countries, in solar, in cell fuel technology, and wind. A whole raft of opportunities are available to African countries, and they are investing in those areas because they don't have to contend with a powerful lobby that would resist change. So, for example, South Africa, Eskom, is investing $300 billion in renewable energy in the next 10 years. And a large part of that is nuclear power plants, as my colleague has just mentioned. A big part of it is also solar power. And distributed energy is a big thing in Africa because you don't have the terrain and you don't have the infrastructure for the kind of energy distribution that requires major infrastructure. And so this is an area where the revolution in distributed energy is actually going to take place in Africa because of the disadvantages that Africa has. So that disadvantage turns into an advantage. And You need to watch out in the next 20 or 30 years. You will see what happened in the cell phone industry happening in the energy field in Africa. So the price bubble in the energy area is actually a blessing to Africa in a win-win situation. Now there are downsides that are obviously we can talk about. In the commodity area where I spent a little more time, a lot of my career at the bank, at the World Bank, was in agricultural development. Well, high commodity prices are by and large beneficial to the economy because these economies are agricultural commodities, raw commodities are what they produce, and therefore you have a strong income effect. In the past, you had a currency appreciation and misalignment accompanying high commodity prices. With full currency liberalization across the board, that is not really a big issue anymore. And the issue is how do you manage the windfalls that come from high commodity prices so that governments don't go on a spending spree. Again, with the liberalized economy, governments are not capturing these resources. The foreign exchange comes into the country, but is by and large in private hands, by and large in the hands of farmers and smallholder farmers. So the meeting of the MDGs becomes more realistic. Incomes are growing and in some cases by very high multiples across the board because of high commodity prices. The challenges that the authorities have to deal with have to do with food prices going up. You have to remember that food prices go up and you have riots in Mozambique, you have riots in some of the cities. But that is a very small downside compared to the fact that 95% of the population in most African countries are agricultural, rural-based. Now, the urban community is growing very rapidly. Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing continent. But at the same time, high food prices benefit farmers who produce the food and therefore can take more children to school. And there's a supply response. The income goes up. And what governments have to do is to manage the vulnerables, the people who are communities that are vulnerable, and to ensure that there is a social safety net provided. One other thing I'd like to say, and then stop here, is the technology and the green revolution that is yet to come to Africa. Any economy that has advanced, including the United States, the history of economic development is very clear. You must succeed in agriculture first before you can succeed in any other sector. Industrialization as a goal is a mirage. First, you have your agricultural base successful, then you are able to release labor and incomes to go to other sectors. One of the main reasons why Africa has not developed, apart from poor governance and corruption and interference from foreign powers, it's always been a place where foreign powers come to fight for resources. And that is a curse of Africa, being the richest continent in the world, has attracted there's a scramble for Africa's resources from the colonial times, pre-colonial times, and now today. Fortunately, the African governments that at least can protect the natural wealth of the country is a little better than in the past. But what needs to be done now is to use the increased food prices to support an agricultural revolution in Africa. That is the missing link in Africa. If agriculture is successful, and there's greater focus now on agriculture than in the past, because in the past there was a mistaken idea that the way you develop is to industrialize. Industrialization is an outcome. It's not what you do, it's the outcome of being developed. So what's happening, I'm involved extensively with financing agricultural research at the World Bank with the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, the CGIAR group, and I'm an advisor to that organization because I spend a lot of my time in the bank supporting those kinds of projects, of course, for the World Bank. This has not taken place in Africa because the prices, commodity prices, particularly food prices, were so low that they could not support innovation. And then also with EU agricultural trade policies and American and US agricultural trade policies that were hostile. So we are seeing high prices supporting agricultural revolution, and we hope that the green revolution will be a natural consequence of the high prices, and that will be a good thing.
Thank you very much. Mr. Batbold, two very important issues were just raised. One is the importance of mined metals for economic development and industrialization, and the second one is food security. And we have seen a lot of agricultural investments by China, by Gulf countries, and so on. What kind of role Mongolia could play? You have, for example, one of the largest copper deposits in Mongolia explored by Ivanhoe Mining. But it raises also important questions from where do you get the energy? Do you have coal deposits, or how do you want to basically exploit these resources? Could you give us a kind of impression where Mongolia could play a role here, particularly with relation to China?
Yes, I think there are some, I would say, good things in that respect for Mongolia. We have a lot of natural resources. That's a big advantage what we have in these days. And we are next to China, next to major, one of the high growth economy as a market. And now thing is, how do we really manage this and make it to the best interest of Mongolia, and also with the, equally importantly, we take care of the interest of the investors and our neighbors and other international investors. We have a lot of major deposits and copper and gold, and beside that, we do have a lot of sort of other minerals, and those could become source of the energy. We have probably the largest deposit of the coking coal, and we have a lot of resources of the energy coal, and we do find a lot of interest to develop those important minerals, not only from China, but from many other partners. We do have, Paul has mentioned about the deficiency and importance of the other sort of minerals and the sources of the energies like uranium, and so we do have, and I think it looks like Mongolia could become one of the major also supplier of the uranium in the future. We do find a lot of resources and reserves of the uranium. We do have cooperation to that extent with many countries. We have a quite close cooperation with the French group Areva, and they are very strong in Mongolia. We are working with Japanese on that, companies like Toshiba and many other companies. We are working with the Chinese on that too. And we're about to sign intergovernment sort of a memorandum for the cooperation on the uranium field with the United States. And fortunately, also what we find more now here is the rare earth. And we had recently the Minister of the Foreign Affairs of Japan to Mongolia. And this issue of the ban of the export on rare earth from China to Japan and other countries becoming a very important and very sort of a sensitive issue. And so that there is a good role for Mongolia to compensate and to make a mutually beneficial cooperation with our friends and partners around Mongolia. And what we care here is most importantly now the technology. We do mostly export now the raw materials and commodities, in raw basis. And we are a landlocked country, and the cost of the transit for Mongolia, if we compare to our GDP, it's about up to 10%. So important thing for us is not only in economic terms and cost, but job creation and technology, is bringing the good technology and encouraging the evaluating and processing in these industries. And for that extent, we would like to see our partners, and not only from China, but more importantly, we would like to seek the investment and technology-based investment from United States or from North America, European Union, and from other partners. So I think we do provide quite a unique opportunity for these days. So therefore, we are considered to be probably with the growth potentials and with the speed what we have these days, and we are considered one of the most attractive economies in Asia.
Thank you. Paul, you've mentioned uranium. You were pretty optimistic with regard to nuclear energy and to uranium. You said it's kind of renewable or at least reusable. But you spoke, for example, about uranium in seawater. That doesn't have a lot of concentration. Yeah? So you basically need more energy to enrich this uranium than what you would get out of it afterwards in terms of energy from a power plant. That's why, for example, the Energy Watch Group or Oxford Research Group have argued we need to focus on the high-grade uranium. And here we will see shortages already over the next 20, 30 years. Yeah? So what can be done that these shortages can be avoided, or in terms of reprocessing, what you have mentioned, aren't we behind the curve in terms of building up capacity for reprocessing? There's not a single working reprocessing plant at this stage.
Well, with regard to the seawater, I mentioned that only to point out that there is uranium there, but it's clearly expensive to take out. It would be a lot like some of the most difficult ultra-deep water, super heavy oils. We're not going to go jumping toward those oils immediately if we have other things available. The high-grade ore, meaning the percentage of U-235 that can be found in an ore base, is not as prevalent as we would like it to be. And certainly the prices would go up if the investment is not sufficient. But there are lots of places in the world where that investment hasn't really happened yet. There are huge opportunities in many countries, including Mongolia, to find further reserves. My assumption is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, most of the territory of Mongolia has not been looked at yet.
Yeah, almost 95.
Almost 95% has not been explored.
Yeah.
In many other countries, the same thing. And with regard to reprocessing, we have a couple of defunct plants, one in Louisiana that was shut down a long time ago. It would cost us tens of billions of dollars to start these reprocessing plants up again. However, in the long run, the return to those reprocessing plants could be quite good if they're operated efficiently and as part of the global nuclear energy partnership, which means it wouldn't be just using US nuclear waste, but other countries' nuclear waste and processing through our facilities. Facilities in Le Hague in France, that's a possibility for expansion as well. The French are using nuclear electricity without the political difficulties that we find here. One of the biggest problems we have here is siting issues, dealing with the lawyers and certain NGOs, and also a sense that nuclear power is not safe. If you were to look at the number of fatalities and illnesses from the use of coal, it is way beyond nuclear. I know that's an odd statistic to pull out of the air. But also, nuclear is quite an efficient way of producing electricity. If the fuel price changes, the uranium price changes, the actual production cost of producing the electricity in nuclear doesn't change that much because the overall cost of fuel is quite small. If the price of natural gas changes, the price of producing electricity based on natural gas can fluctuate all over the place. That's a big plus for nuclear energy. My optimism, of course, is tempered by the policy situation in this country in particular. In China, it's a lot easier. The leadership says, build nuclear power plants, and everyone says, let's do it. China is making its own nuclear technology. So it's not using nuclear technology from elsewhere. It has entire plants produced with Chinese parts, Chinese expertise. Many people are behind the curve in understanding what's going on here. It could be not too long in the future, China will be a major exporter of nuclear technology. And they are the driving force in nuclear's resurgent, they and the Russians. The Russians are using different technology than we use here with different containment devices that could prove to be problematic. But there's a huge need for electricity in Russia over the next few years. Another driving force behind nuclear's resurgence, particularly in the Middle East, is water, desalination. It's a massive issue in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is building a series of new cities, giant cities. Eckart, you know about these cities. Most of those cities will find their fresh water through desalination plants. It's a risk. It's a serious risk. Someone with a cement truck could shut down a city. The Jordanians are one of the most resource-poor countries on earth. Water poor, energy poor, and they want to solve both issues with nuclear by building a plant near Aqaba. They'll take the water from the Gulf of Aqaba, desalinate it, clean it up with the nuclear plant, and send it to the population centers. There are lots of things driving this. Also, no CO2 is produced by a typical nuclear power plant. CO2 is produced in uranium extraction, however. The environmentalists and the pro-nuclear people are both behind the nuclear resurgence, which is very different. You can have people like John Kerry and Jim Woolsey in the same room agreeing that we should produce nuclear power.
John, you said the problem with oil is above ground, not below ground. But isn't that a bit too optimistic if we take a look, for example, at the rapidly declining production in the North Sea, also in the US? Okay, you have a couple of, you have deep sea oil as a kind of new frontier. But having said that, basically peak oil in the US happened in the 1970s. So where do you see the kind of new frontiers on a global level? And will these new production facilities be really enough to supply world oil markets with enough oil?
Well, I think so, but again, it depends at what price. Now, in the US, I'm not willing to give up. Clearly, we've had increased production in the US recently in two major areas. First is the deep water, where we've had tremendous technological development that's allowed us to be able to now produce a substantial component of our oil supply in the deep water Gulf of Mexico. I think that can also continue around the world. It depends on how we work our way through the potential changes as a result of the Deepwater Horizon accident. We also have technological development in shale oil, where, for example, North Dakota now is the 4th largest producing state, because they've been able to figure out how you take a vast deposit of oil and develop it with hydraulic fracturing and be able to produce more oil than you've ever dreamed of. The similar situation is with natural gas, where natural gas I didn't mention, but we thought we were basically at a plateau of natural gas where it was going to ultimately decline significantly and we were going to need to import a lot of liquefied natural gas. Well, right now, with the developments of the shale properties around the US because of technology, whether it be Barnett, Haynesville, Fayetteville, or in my home area of Pennsylvania, the Marcellus Shale, we found vast deposits of natural gas that can be used far beyond what we had dreamed of. So yes, I think that going forward, we can see meeting the needs of consumers if the industry is able to make the investments in areas that we can't right now, if the governments involved will craft policies that make sense, that don't hinder the oil industry in ways that are unneeded, if we're not basically excessively taxed the way we experienced back in the 70s. But those, of course, are big ifs. I continue to be optimistic about the future.
Joseph, you have called for a green revolution in Africa. My question would be, what will happen? You are probably part of this revolution because your company, WambiaCapital, is investing in Africa and is facilitating investments in Africa. My question would be, how can the smallholder peasants, who are the large majority of the rural population in Africa, be part of that? Or is there a real danger that they might be left out, that only a couple of big agro companies basically reap the profits while they will have to migrate to the cities where you already have quite a lot of population? I would also doubt here a bit your kind of vision that you said, okay, the agricultural sector needs to develop, so labor is set free for industrialization and development in the cities. The cities are already crowded, so what will happen to these people?
Well, already incomes are rising throughout rural Africa, more than doubled in the last 20 years because of improved agricultural policies and agricultural incomes. Agricultural production. And the most important determinant for that, not only has it been technological advancement, thanks in large part to the work of the CGIAR, which is providing the network of research institutions across the developing world, and a lot of those products are important to Africa. But also due to market access, which has improved, it's still very difficult for African countries and African farmers to export their produce to advanced countries, to the United States, to Europe. In what they do best, they cannot sell in world markets which are closed. So there's the political economy there, which really will determine the future of the poor African farmer is determined in the United States Congress and Senate and in European parliaments than actually what is happening in Africa. Now, the green revolution that is only beginning to take place in a few places. Agriculture in Kenya is growing very well. Nigeria is investing a tremendous amount of money in smallholder-based agriculture. And also the notion of what is the right technology and what's the right business model has changed in Africa. In my early years in the World Bank in the early 80s into the early 90s, most African governments were aspiring to the European and American model of agriculture, which is large-scale farming, mechanized farming, because that's what you came here and saw as an example of successful commercial agriculture. I think people have now gotten smarter than that. They've realized that these large farms that you see in the United States and in much of Europe, these are not businesses. These are not economically viable enterprises. These are big subsidy operations that can only be sustained because they're in a wealthy country. And if you try that in a poor African country, you quickly discover that those are lifestyles being maintained. So moreover, the African landscape doesn't allow for this large mechanized kind of farming. So that's gone. You don't see that being pursued across Africa. What you see is irrigation beginning to take place. Nigeria has brought millions of acres under irrigation through smallholder irrigation called the Fadama irrigation schemes. And I was privileged to be a pioneer in financing that while I was still at the World Bank. This is shallow tube well irrigation. And those of you who know South Asia, particularly Pakistan, and the Indus Basin, that's another place where I spent about 10 years financing smallholder irrigation through shallow tube wells. This is spreading right across Africa. And it's phenomenal because what it is, it's a pump, a Honda pump that costs $500 or $300 or $1,000 if you're a moderately successful person. And you drill a hole that's 40 feet deep or even shallower. You put in a liter of fuel and you pull up the pump and there's your irrigation scheme. And that allows you to irrigate your 1 or 2 acres of land, as opposed to the previous schemes which were based on large-scale irrigation canals and channels which are not easy to maintain and are capital intensive. So what is happening in Africa is the business model, even for agriculture, is smallholder based. And I'll just give you another anecdote. People used to migrate into the cities. Now, people are going back to the rural areas where they came back from because everyone has realized that the real money is not in the cities, the real income is not in the cities, it's developing the rural areas. And people are investing extensively across the continent.
Thank you. May I take some questions from the audience, please? Yes, please.
Good afternoon. This question is for Dr. Paul Sullivan. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. The Treaty of Pelindaba, which came into force July 2009, made Africa, the African continent, a nuclear weapon-free zone. Now, by virtue of Article 4 of the MPT, which calls for peaceful use of civil nuclear energy, my questions for you are, firstly, do you believe that Africa is ready for civil nuclear energy? Secondly, the question is as regards the highly enriched uranium. I have had the pleasure of asking 1 or 2 delegates of the UN the question of highly enriched uranium for the African continent. The question which keeps coming back to me is the disposal of highly enriched uranium. Now, how would the African continent dispose of highly enriched uranium? And the final question is, what will be the effect of civil nuclear energy on the African continent as an alternative source of energy? Thank you very much.
Maybe we can take another question and No other question at this stage? Okay, then Paul, please. Yes.
Well, in American terminology, that was a curveball. That is not an easy question to answer, and in many African countries, it would probably make more sense to look at other alternative fuels, given maybe the culture of maintenance and safety and the overall infrastructure available, the problem with rule of law, and other issues that may make building nuclear energy problematic, to put it nicely. And this is not just a case of Africa, it's a case of many parts of the world. With regard to the highly enriched uranium, the uranium that is used in an electrical generating plant is the low enriched uranium. The waste product is not highly enriched uranium. It really doesn't get to that level. It's through the reprocessing and other methods where you can enrich it further. HEU is used for bomb-grade material. In each electricity generating plant that uses even 3 to 7% low-grade uranium, you have a certain higher grade uranium that could be used for other sorts of nefarious activities, as well as plutonium being produced through the neutrons essentially bombarding the uranium and turning it into plutonium. I'm not going to get too much into nuclear physics here, but still you have an issue with that. Where would you deal with the nuclear waste? Well, the African countries who are seriously thinking about this and can fulfill the NPT requirements, which are not easy to fulfill, could become part of the global nuclear energy partnership and essentially have the uranium reprocessed elsewhere and the uranium waste put elsewhere. But a lot of technical things have to be taken care of before even this discussion can progress. And any other country other than South Africa, Egypt has progressed to some extent, Algeria to some extent, but Tanzania is talking about nuclear energy, and I was in Tanzania a year and a half ago. I don't think they're ready for it. But someday, every African country could be ready for it, could be ready for new energy systems. And one thing that is one of the major problems holding Africa back is the lack of electricity. Only about 17% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa above South Africa, below North Africa, have access to electricity. It's holding them back. Only 3% of the hydropower potential of the continent is being used. And if you take a look at World Bank figures and other figures about electricity's connection with development, it's so clear. Think of education, think of health, think of transportation. Well, just think about the following: having lights at night for the children to do their homework. Electricity can make a huge difference. How could you start a factory in a place where the electricity is a car battery? And most small towns and villages in Africa are that. Sorry, again, it's one of these things I could go on for the next day. All right.
Thank you very much, Paul. I need to thank Mr. Batbold, who has to leave us. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Yes, thank you very much for coming.